Welcome into the Beachside Blitz. I'm your host, Patricia Caputo on Cape May Radio's WCFA 101.5 FM, the Center for Community Arts, Cape May. I am so excited to start off the show with another segment of Seaside Sit Downs, this time with Lauren Meyer, who will be joining us today. Thank you so much for joining me, Miss Meyer. And she is the director of a film called The Other Boys of Summer, and that film shares the stories of civil rights and civil rights activists through the lens of players who played in the Negro Leagues. So like I said, she is the director. So Miss Lauren, let's start with you on, I know that you had a passion for a film such as this one many, many years ago when you were younger. Can you speak on that a little bit more?
Absolutely. Growing up, I didn't learn about the Negro Leagues. I had never heard of them. But then when you hear one thing and you start learning a little bit about, wait, there was this other league, professional baseball players, and I learned that they weren't able to participate in Major League Baseball 100% because of the color of their skin. I just thought, well, that to me sounded ridiculous. But more importantly, I started reading some books and things like that to learn more about it. But that immediately I thought, you know, I would love to hear stories from the players themselves. I'd just to have the opportunity to talk to them to find out what was it like, why did they pursue playing baseball under the harshest of conditions, sort of just the personal side of it, more so than the baseball side. To me, it was more of a, how do you pursue your dreams in spite of your circumstances?
And when you began this, one of the hurdles was just that some of the players had passed away. So there was, you could say, a more narrow pool in terms of deciding who you were going to interview. So how did you get over that hurdle and find players who were willing to speak to you about their experiences?
Absolutely. So I'd like to start just by saying that when I reached out to players, they were all so gracious. And I had no idea if they would be willing to tell me their stories. They don't know me from anyone. So I didn't know what their response would be. And what I found was the most wonderful, welcoming, gracious individuals who all were happy to share their stories. And what I learned through spending time meeting with them and interviewing them was that I think they were happy to share their stories because for them, later in life, most of these players were in their 80s. There were a few in their 70s, and Red Moore, when I interviewed him, was in his 90s. But at this stage of their lives, for them to have somebody who had an authentic interest in hearing their story, I think that's one of the reasons why they, felt comfortable sharing it, is they wanted to make sure, number one, they just wanted to share their stories with somebody who cared.
Mhm.
And I thankfully was able to be comfortable with them, and they felt comfortable sharing their stories, knowing that there wasn't a guarantee of what would come of these interviews. I said I want to make a film, but I can't guarantee what the final product's going to be. So when I finally, was able to meet them and hear their stories, there was no guarantee, but they all felt very compelled to share because I had promised them I would do the best I could to make sure that their legacy was continually told beyond their years, in terms of they all knew, hey, like Red Moore was 91, I think, at the time. And so he knew that there's only so many more times he can share that story, and then somebody else has to tell it. So to capture them sharing their personal experiences was a really unique and special opportunity.
And while there were some players who probably did tell their story quite a few times, did you interview anybody who this was one of the first times that they were telling the story to anybody?
Well, I think that they each came at it from a little bit of a different perspective. Some of them obviously had shared their experiences with their families. They might have had a local paper who found out, oh, you played baseball? Tell me about this. But the bigger picture of what they went through playing and participating in the Negro Leagues really hadn't been a major media focus at that time. I started interviewing players in 2007. So this is before there was, the recent attention on the Negro Leagues. In 2020, it was the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Negro National League. And that was a time where the spotlight began to get focused on the Negro Leagues again. And to give credit also where credit's due, Buck O'Neil was probably one of the biggest celebrity, became a celebrity in terms of being able to draw attention to the Negro Leagues. He was featured in Ken Burns's documentary Baseball, which was a 9 episode huge documentary that, was obviously wonderful, but it had some attention given to the Negro Leagues, and that attention, those stories were really highlighted by Buck O'Neil being able to tell those stories. And so Buck was very charismatic and told the history really well. So I think we have to give him credit for initially bringing attention to the Negro Leagues through Ken Burns's documentary film about baseball. But the approach that I was interested in was completely different from Ken Burns's approach. And it wasn't that I was, passing judgment on one style versus another. But in my personal experience, I felt like most documentaries, specifically the one about baseball, can often feel like it's a history lesson being told to you by a narrator. And then there's pretty pictures that you're looking at, but often it's just the voice of a narrator, often, a famous person who's reciting history. And that's amazing for so many reasons. But my personal interest was about hearing the stories first person from those who lived it. And so I set out to interview as many players as I could so that they could tell their stories versus a narrator. And I do think it's important to give credit to when I had completed the interviews, which took a very long time, and we can talk about that. But once I was putting the whole film together, it did need some narration. And I felt very strongly that I wanted to make sure that there was the right person to link these segments together. It wasn't going to be a voice from above teaching you the history lesson, but it was a voice that was able to connect these individual pieces and stitch them together. And by default, so many people suggested to me all sorts of baseball names, 99% of them being male, of course. Oh, you should have Dave Winfield. You should get this person. You should get that person. And they were all great suggestions, but it didn't feel like the film I was trying to make. And I wanted to really lean into the human side of it and the civil rights side of it and engage a voice who the story was authentic to, but also a voice that was spectacular. And I was very fortunate to be able to get Miss Cicely Tyson, who is a legend, like a career beyond careers in terms of what she had accomplished. She was in her 90s and she agreed to narrate the film. And, that to me just brought a whole new layer to the presentation of what it was we were able to tell.
And I think it's so important to be able to tell these things because even as a sports broadcast major myself, I did not learn about this in school until just last year, and that's by going to college. So you learn about baseball, you learn about the MLB, but we often brush over the Negro Leagues, which was just as important as other leagues and had such an impact on baseball as we know it. But like you had mentioned, there was a whole nother layer when you were playing in the Negro Leagues, and part of that was civil rights. So when you're doing these interviews, what's insight for people who just don't know or haven't been able to have access to this sort of insight? What are just some of the injustices that these players faced off the field, especially when they were traveling?
So the players in the Negro Leagues, to set it up properly, and thank you for even setting it up and introducing it and inviting me to be part of this conversation. So the players in the Negro Leagues, they were playing the game of baseball at the top level. It wasn't that the Negro Leagues were a lower level league. It was just in America, segregation was the law, specifically in the South, but that gave permission to, and it's interesting because it was considered, and I use air quotes, a gentleman's agreement was decided that blacks and whites shouldn't play together. And so back in the 1800s, there were black baseball players who played on teams with white baseball players, even up to the major league level. But then there was this gentleman's agreement, and suddenly, no, blacks and whites should not play together. And so what's important to understand is the Negro Leagues were not a minor league system. It was a very well-established business. It was run successfully as a business, launched the Negro National League in 1920. There were a number of teams, I think it was 7 or 8 in the inaugural season. They had a schedule. Ultimately, they developed a World Series. They had an all-star game called the East-West Classic that brought together 50,000 people to Comiskey Park in Chicago. So this isn't like a little side of the road sort of side game. This is a legitimate professional league. And so the players who were playing in the Negro Leagues, in addition to having to be phenomenal baseball players, they also had to deal with the day-to-day of racism in America. And specifically, many cities that they would travel to, they didn't have hotels where they could stay. They would have to stay with other people at homes, or there'd be a specific Black hotel that they were allowed to stay in. There were players, so many of the players shared their stories with me of not being able to eat in restaurants. They had to stop at a grocery store often, and sometimes they weren't even allowed in certain stores, and buy items and then eat them on their bus. They would travel by bus. And one of the stories that sticks out so strongly is, so Bob Scott was one of the players I interviewed, and he played for the New York Black Yankees as well as the Memphis Red Sox. And Bob got a chance to barnstorm with Jackie Robinson All-Stars, and this is around 1950. And at this point, Jackie had been in the majors, so he was the mentor, and many of the players I interviewed talked about this. He was a mentor and told people what to expect when you make it to the majors. Here's what you can expect, and here's how you handle this situation or that situation. Well, Bob told me a story about when he was traveling with the Jackie Robinson All-Stars, and they got to Charleston, South Carolina. Bob said there was nowhere for them to sleep that night. No hotels would let them stay, and they had to sleep on the floor of a funeral home. And when he tells that story, you just see it in his eyes, the reality of it, as though he's remembering it. And he says, I'll never forget that. We had to stay at the floor of a funeral home in Charleston, South Carolina. So that's, to me, one of these images that you can't even imagine today, that a professional athlete who's traveling to play in an all-star team is sleeping on the floor of a funeral home.
Yes, when I was doing research, I also researched Willie Curly Williams, who played for the New York Eagles and also the Houston Eagles, eventually the New Orleans Eagles. He said that he mentioned that he cried so much at the pro
Yep.
level because of how poorly he was treated. And that brings me kind of to my next question of, what were the injustices that they faced on the field as well, if any?
Well, it varied depending on if they were playing Negro League games, they were playing against other Negro League teams. So what's interesting to me is that their fan base, obviously, the Black community wanted to come out and support and watch the Negro Leagues, but they also had a really big following among white fans. And so when they were playing within the Negro Leagues, the games, they didn't, the field was somewhat of a safe place. They can go out and play the game that they loved, and they didn't have to deal with any injustices in terms of being, discriminated against on the field. But getting to the field was a whole different story. And when they were able to excel on the field, and then ultimately after Jackie broke the color barrier, you had players like Monty Irvin, who signed with the Giants, and you had Curly Williams, who signed. He's not a big famous name, but you brought him up, so I can elaborate a little because I did meet him and spend some time with him. So Curly, ultimately, he did barnstorm with Jackie as well, and then he was signed to the farm system, or a minor league contract, as you'd call it today, with the White Sox. And he traveled out by train to Avon Park, Colorado for a spring training. And he told me all about it. And one of the things that is in the film, within The Other Boys of Summer, which is my film, one of the stories he shares that gets me every time. I've seen the film hundreds or thousands of times at this point. But Curly tells a story about, when he got to Avon Park in Colorado, they put him up at a preacher's house because the rest of the team, the majority of the team, were all white. So they all stayed in one part of town. They had different housing accommodations. Most of them stayed at a hotel together. But Curly wasn't allowed to stay there because he was Black. And so Curly was put up at a preacher's house, and he had a roommate there. And his roommate was a player from Mexico. And so the two of them stayed at this preacher's house, separate from the rest of the team. And he said, they'd go to practice and then they'd go get food after practice or after a game. And he said, he'll never forget it because there was this restaurant they used to go to as a team, and they'd let him come in, but they wouldn't let him sit in the restaurant. They made him sit in the kitchen, not his teammates, but the restaurant owner. And so he said, I'll never forget that. The whole team's out there in the restaurant and my table was in the kitchen. He said, and he would see the kitchen door swing open and he'd see all of his teammates there. And he said the one thing that got to him the most out of that was his roommate, which was this Mexican player. He said his roommate was allowed to sit in the dining room with the rest of the team. And he said, but he had to sit in the kitchen. And he said to me, it's just like, and it's in the film, he tells a story about how he'll never forget how it felt that he'd see all the players and his roommate, a man from another country, allowed to sit in his country with his teammates, but he wasn't allowed. And what he said, to go back to what you had said earlier, was he used to cry himself to sleep at night. He said it just made him feel better because he'd take it on all day long, all the discrimination and all the racism. And he said at night he used to just cry himself to sleep because it would make him feel better. And for those of you, which are probably 99% of you listening, who don't know Curly Williams, you can't picture him. He is a teddy bear of a guy. He was probably about 6'2" to 6'4". I don't remember exactly. Big, strong guy, as gentle as could be. And so just picture this big guy sitting in the kitchen and then going home at night and crying himself to sleep. Like it just broke my heart.
Yeah, I can imagine that was something I was reading about him, that he also played in Canada and he liked playing there a lot better because he
Yep.
felt he didn't face as many injustices there as he did, like you had mentioned, in his own country of America during that time. And
Yeah.
Curly
Yeah, he
Williams,
definitely he talked about how he really loved it in Canada because race wasn't an issue and he made friends black and white. And one of his friends in Canada was another, I think it was a black player, I guess from the US. I don't remember the details of this story, but he said that when Curly was coming back down to the States, I don't know if it was just for a visit or to play ball or whatever it was, he invited his friend, his teammate, to come with him. And his teammate said, I can't go down there because his teammate, who was another black man, had married a white woman. And he said, we're fine up here. He's just like, I can't go back there. He's just like, you know, I'm happy living up here. I can't do that, because he knew that it wouldn't be accepted. He'd be discriminated against and it could potentially be dangerous.
right? And so we talked about Curly Williams, part of the Newark Eagles, but there was also another huge name who was a part of the Newark Eagles, who was a woman as well, and Effa Manley, who just played a huge part in that organization. So can you tell us her role as an owner for the Eagles?
So Effa Manley will start out by saying she is the only female enshrined in Cooperstown, the Baseball Hall of Fame, individually. She has a plaque in Cooperstown. Her title under her name is as a baseball executive, because she owned, with her husband, she and Abe owned the New Eagles, and she was the manager. She, not the on-field manager, she managed the business of it. And so she made sure that the guys all got their paychecks. She made sure that they had, their schedule was in place, the teams, everything was coordinated well. She made sure that the team had hotels to stay at when they traveled, made sure that the whole business side of it was buttoned up. And she was so well respected by all the players as well as other managers. And ultimately, that's when she became, a Hall of Famer, was because of her reputation. She also was a staunch civil rights advocate. She, not only did they have a stadium that was the Newark Eagles Stadium, it was Rupert Stadium in Newark, New Jersey. She and the Eagles would host other events there to support civil rights and raise funds. They even did a fundraiser, which I found really interesting when I was doing some research on her. They did a fundraiser where she raised money to basically to create scholarships for African American students to pursue medical school, because apparently there, as a Black student, you were not able to go to medical school in most of the colleges. And she thought that that was completely ridiculous and horrible. And the Black community needed doctors the same as the white community. And so she did fundraisers to create scholarships so that African American students interested in pursuing medicine could go to medical school.
As a woman in such a male-dominated field that is dominated today, it was dominated back then, did she face any discrimination being a woman in a power seat such as that one?
I can honestly say I don't know too much. I haven't heard too much about that because everything I've heard and read from players and other people who, even players' wives and people who knew her, like recently in the last few years, I've met people who knew Effa Manley. I was like, oh my God, you knew her? Like she's a real person. You and I read about her in a book as past tense because she passed away, I want to say in the 1980s. But she, her reputation is truly as a respected businesswoman. And she absolutely um, did have to prove herself and struggle and wasn't taken seriously all the time by the other male executives. But she also had a great respect from many of the other managers and executives. So there was a little bit of both. She absolutely had to fight harder and she always stood her ground. There are letters that people, if you're interested, you can look up. It's in the Newark Library. They have it online now. There's the Effa Manley Papers, and it's all her business dealings. And it shows everything from she and her husband owned real estate and everything from when they had to go and fix somebody's front door or window or something. Those papers are there, but there's also contracts and letters from ball players who wrote to her asking for an opportunity to try out for the Eagles. There's one letter that we included in the film that was from a player in Cuba who was saying, I just want a shot to try out. Can I come up? Like all I'm asking for is, maybe it was, whatever transportation to get there. But once I'm there, I just want to prove that I can play. And there were other, you know, there are letters. There's a great letter in the collection that I remember reading quite a while ago, but it was correspondence between Effa Manley and Monty Irvin, Hall of Famer, who played for Effa on the Eagles. And the bottom line was they were going back and forth discussing his contract. And in the end, it was, what she had him under contract. So she wasn't willing to let him go unless he was getting compensated properly and she was getting compensated. And that was a big thing, an issue that comes up sometimes when people ask about it in terms of Jackie Robinson. Effa Manley felt very strongly that, and I think it's historically accurate, factual, that Branch Rickey stole Jackie from the Negro Leagues. Jackie was playing for the Kansas City Monarchs. I can't speak to whether or not he had a contract or what the details of his contract were. But when Branch Rickey approached Jackie and signed him to Brooklyn or him to the Dodgers organization, he didn't contact the Kansas City Monarchs. He didn't contact J.L. Wilkinson, who owned the team. He just spoke to Jackie and he signed Jackie to a contract and never compensated anybody for the fact that they already had him playing on their team. And so Effa had strong feelings about that. And she said she's not interested in any of her Newark Eagles being stolen from Major League Baseball. And about 2.5 months after Jackie stepped foot on the baseball field at Ebbets Field playing for the Dodgers, Larry Doby he stepped foot to play for the Cleveland Indians at the time. Now, Doby was under contract with the Newark Eagles. When Bill Vick, who owned the Indians, wanted to get Doby on his team, he had to go through Effa. And ultimately, they agreed on a contract. And so Larry Doby got compensated what was considered fair value at the time. Effa and Vick went back and forth about what was fair. And there's conversation, an interview with her where she says she told Bill that if Doby had been white, he would have paid him so much more money. And Vic 100% agreed. But so Effa got paid for to sign Doby over to Cleveland, as well as Doby got paid. I think it was, I might be off on the numbers. I think it was $10,000 for his initial contract, or maybe it was 5,000. I don't recall the details, but if he was still on the team 30 days later, he got a bonus. So that was to speak to his skill level and to that, hey, we're going to take him, but we're only giving him X amount of dollars, but if he can prove himself, then we will pay him more. And so that was a big thing that Effa Manley really should get the acknowledgement for, is that she fought for her players. And she also fought for her business of the Newark Eagles. She wasn't giving players away. This is a professional business run professionally.
And contracts today are still a big discussion, but also there has been a lot of attention on the Negro Leagues, especially with Hinchcliffe Stadium reopening in Paterson, New Jersey, but also in June, the San Francisco Giants played the St. Louis Cardinals at Rickwood Field in Birmingham, Alabama. So, as someone who has done this film, I believe some of your members and possibly you were there as well. But how do you think games like this are able to bring awareness to what the Negro Leagues were, but also help recognize these players who, like we had mentioned, were very often overlooked?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's great that Major League Baseball and other organizations are starting to acknowledge and shine the spotlight on the Negro Leagues. And it's really about, for me, it's about their legacy. You can't go back and change history. And I don't think you want to go changing history, but I think you want to learn from it. And I think you want to celebrate it. And when I say celebrate it, of course, there's lots of negative parts of it too. And you don't want to celebrate that, but you don't want to brush that under the rug and forget it either. It's really important. So I think that the Rickwood game was very important. I think it's amazing that MLB actually did it. There was a lot of talk about people wanting a game at Rickwood for a very long time before it happened. So the fact that it it came about this year, and it was just, I think it was put on really, really well. I think that it was great to have the two teams who played there being the Giants as well as the Cardinals, because most people know plenty about Willie Mays and the fact that he was, with the Giants. He got his start at Rickwood Field. Growing up as a teenager, he played there. He played on the Birmingham Black Barons. He was on the team, I think it was 1948, who won the Negro American League pennant at Rickwood Field. Part of that team that he was on, the Birmingham Black Barons that year, one of his mentors and friends was a guy named Bill Greason. Bill Greason went on to be the first Black pitcher signed to the St. Louis Cardinals. So there's a photo that you probably have seen, and others listening, if they're baseball fanatics, that specifically the Negro Leagues, probably see this photo of the 1948 Birmingham Black Barons, and you've got this teenage Willie Mays, but you also have Bill Greason in that same photo. Well, Bill Greason and Willie Mays maintained a friendship up until Willie Mays passed away the day before the game. Mm-hmm. And so Bill Greason lives in Birmingham, and he was there at that game. And I think that hopefully people start to learn more about some of the less famous players, just because there's so much history there. And to kind of stay on point of that, not to go too far off, I think that different types of events like the Rickwood game is super important. I think another event that took place in May this year, which was really important and I think wonderful, was the East-West Classic at the Baseball Hall of Fame, which was to celebrate the East-West Classic, which was the all-star game of the Negro Leagues. It used to take place every summer as well. So I think that was really important. You've got a couple of years ago, I think it was 2020, right when the pandemic began, you've got the Players Alliance started up, which is founded by Black baseball players, former players, part of who started it. But what makes it run today is that it includes current players of, players who are supporting the Players Alliance are not just Black players. You've got Latino players, you've got white players, you've got all sorts of players putting their belief and support behind it. And what the Players Alliance is doing is they're helping to, number one, keep the story alive, but they're also helping to engage and encourage and inspire the next generation to pursue the game of baseball. So they constantly, every year, they've got a different initiative, but they travel and they bring baseball to the communities that are often just forgotten about or excluded. Baseball can be a really expensive game to compete in, and to make it to the higher levels, traditionally, historically, you need to have money. And often it excludes a lot of players in lower income areas. And so the Players Alliance is really working hard to make sure that baseball is accessible for more than just the suburban, wealthier white kids or the players from Latin America. There's so much opportunity and potential interest and talent that just doesn't get the chance. And I think that's a big part of with the other boys of summer, what we do too, is we bring people together to show the film and talk about the history, and it brings people together from all different walks of life. And for me, that's, my favorite part is being able to do programs where people watch the film and then engage in conversations. They get inspired by these players. You fall in love with them when you hear their stories. And it's really, I've seen it make an impact in different communities, different organizations, not just about kids playing baseball, but about people coming together and about new programs and projects being launched because people started talking at programs that we've done. Like next week, we've got a program. You mentioned Hinchcliffe, which is historic baseball stadium that's recently been, reinvented, so to speak. And this past spring, there's a new museum on the property of Hinchcliffe. And the museum obviously talks about Larry Doby and the New York Black Yankees and the Negro Leagues impact. But the museum also talks about Paterson, New Jersey, and that general area and the stadium beyond baseball. And so next week on the 31st, which is I think Wednesday, we're going to be their first like official film screening. That's a community event. It's free. It's so important that so many of the programs that we do are free because we want everyone to be welcome. We don't want to exclude anyone because of a ticket price. So we try and do free programs as often as possible. And I'd say 95% of the programs we've done, if not more than nine, probably about 98 or 99% of our community programs have always been free. And it's, you get a chance to see the film and often have conversations afterwards. And we do panel discussions and it always has different guests. Next week, I'm not sure who, it's family members of former Negro Leaguers are scheduled to be part of the discussion. And so, that's next Wednesday, the 31st. And what's great too is it's at Hinchcliffe. It's at the museum. It's MUTH Museum at Hinchcliffe Stadium in Paterson, New Jersey. And again, it's a small space. It's a new space. It's really, incredible to kind of be able to be on the. It's part of Hinchcliffe Stadium, which is part of like a national park, the Great Falls. So it's just an amazing location. And to be able to watch the film there is going to be really special. And anyone's invited. People, if you're listening and you're interested, you just kind of Google it because you do have to RSVP because it's a small space. It's not a matter of needing a ticket to purchase a ticket, but it's making sure that if you want to come, there's room. And so, that's a lot of, I think, what's important about the other boys of summer, the Players Alliance, the game at Rickwood, the All-Star, the East West Classic, and the new exhibit at the Baseball Hall of Fame. All of these things together help preserve that legacy.
Mm-hmm. And also, in terms of preserving legacy, the MLB did finally add players' statistics who were a part of the Negro Leagues into the same statistics as MLB players. And that drastically shifted some things around, reasonably so, because again, like we had mentioned, the Negro League players were just as good, if not better. So why do you think this took so long to finally happen and for them to be added to the record books?
Well, it took so long because it's so hard to track down the records. Because back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, which is the time period that MLB is including, it's up through 1948. During that time period, everything was segregated in terms of baseball, but also the press that covered the baseball. So you had black newspapers, you had white newspapers, you had different radio stations who would cover, it was very segregated. And so a lot of the black press and newspapers, you had like the Defender in Chicago and you had the Pittsburgh Courier, which are enormous big papers, and those records still exist. But you had so many smaller papers, whether they were white or black, who come and go. And so the Negro League records never had one place they were housed. So to do the research to track down and when I say legitimacy, it's not that the Negro Leagues weren't legitimate, it's that whose records are you keeping? Are you going by this paper? Are you going by so-and-so's cousin who told you that they did this? Like, you need to be able to vet and verify if you want to compare, two players. You need to make sure that their stats are equally, find out where that information came from and just make sure that it's accurate. And so that was an enormous undertaking. And I think for many, many years, there was just a ton of pushback. And finally, it was recognized that, the Negro Leagues, because of all the work that's been done outside of Major League Baseball, the Negro Leagues have been gaining the respect, I think, in terms of, and I don't want to say fan base, but just the general public and population. The more people learn about it, the more attention that it's going to get. And I think that it felt as though, with so many initiatives of trying to bring people together and following George Floyd and everything that took place during the pandemic and all the, racial battles that are continuing on today, I think that baseball recognized that this would be a good thing that they should be doing. This is something that they can do that can include this group that's been proven to have been really, really amazing professional baseball players. There's no reason to keep them out as long as you can confirm that that their stats are verifiable. And so I think that's what was important through 1948 was when Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, that changed the trajectory of the Negro Leagues. Because when MLB began to take all the top players out of the Negro Leagues, I think it's fair to say that the caliber of play in the Negro Leagues was no longer equitable with that of MLB once you took the top stars. When everybody was playing, they were fair game. But once you basically whatever it's called, cherry picked the best players out of one league, that league's not going to be at the same level. And so I think that the Negro Leagues was a sustainable business, and there were really, really great players in the 1950s and even up through the 1960s. But in my opinion, it's probably more equitable to a minor league system at that point in time. But prior to Jackie crossing the color barrier, it was major leagues without a question.
And with all of that, with everything that we talked about today in this interview, what is the final takeaway for listeners today?
I would say the biggest takeaway is that, the stories of these players, it's about, for me, it's about them as human beings. They love playing baseball. They played incredibly well. They worked really hard at it. But for me, it's about what is it like, and this is why I did the film, like, what is it like to pursue your dreams in spite of your circumstances? And when everybody tells you you can't, for whatever the reason is, the color of your skin, it could be your religion, it could be whatever the reason is that you can't do it, you're going to fail. The Negro League players didn't listen. They said, you know what? I love this game. You don't want me to play in your league in Major League Baseball? I understand that. I've never seen anything different, so I don't know that there's an opportunity any other way. But you know what? I love the game of baseball, so I'm going to pursue my dream and I'm going to do it to the best of my ability. And to me, that's the takeaway, is for people, whatever your passion and your dream is, it doesn't have to be baseball or sport, but if it's something that you love doing, I think it's important to pursue that. I think the Negro League players, their perseverance, their grit, and their humility is why I fell in love with them. They're so graceful and they're so humble. They didn't hold on to any anger or bitterness in spite of what they had to endure. When I met them, they weren't angry or bitter. They were proud of being part of this history.
Definitely perseverance is key. Thank you so much for sharing all that and your willingness to come on and speak with us and the listeners about not only the history of the Negro Leagues in New Jersey, but also just the history of the Negro Leagues as a whole. I really appreciate you, Miss Meyer, for coming on and speaking with me today.
Sure, it's my pleasure. And just one last just information for listeners. If you want to find out more about the film, which is The Other Boys of Summer, it's easy to Google it. Tons of stuff will come up, but we just also have the website. It's theotherboysofsummer.com. It's really simple. Our primary focus, we've been doing this for 5 years now. Our focus is always doing programs where we share the film and use the film as a way to bring people together. And so, if anybody's got interest in that, you can find information on the website. Of course, we're all across social media on Instagram, X, Twitter, Facebook, all that stuff too. But what it comes down to is, if for me, it's always about finding what it is that you love to do and not letting somebody else stop you from it. And I think that the Negro Leagues is an incredible example of perseverance in spite of really difficult and unfair situation.
Agreed, 100% agreed. Again, thank you so, so much. I greatly appreciate that. And again, listeners can find that on their website, theotherboysofsummer.com, but also social media, which has been a great help to me as well, just learning about the Negro League. So thank you so much for your willingness to share that information.
Sure, and thank you for the invitation.
You are tuning in to the Beachside Blitz, where we surf the wave of sports on Cape May Radio 101.5, the Center for Community Arts, Cape May. We will be back after these messages. Support for Cape May Radio WCFA 101.5 FM and the Center for Community Arts comes from the Mad Batter Restaurant and Bar, serving breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You can find more information about the Mad Batter located inside the Caravilla Hotel, 19 Jackson Street in Cape May, New Jersey, by visiting madbatter.com. Support for Cape May Radio WCFA 101.5 FM and the Center for Community Arts comes from the Cape May County Coast Guard Community Foundation. The foundation supports projects that show appreciation toward the United States Coast Guard and their families. More information is available at coastguardcommunity.org. Welcome back into the Beachside Blitz, where we surf the wave of sports on Cape May Radio 101.5 FM, the Center for Community Arts, Cape May. I am your host, Patricia Caputo, and I'm so excited to be back here with you today after that interview with Miss Meyer. Again, The Other Boys of Summer, the film, will be showed in Paterson, New Jersey on July 31st. That is a Wednesday. Let's move on to our next segment of What's the Scoop? And the scoop is that the Phillies are in danger. Not really, maybe that's a little over dramatic, but they did take a 3-1 loss to the Guardians on Friday night, and this is not what the team needed after that All-Star break. They swept the Dodgers, then lost to the Athletics. Everyone said, all right, we'll go into the All-Star break, we'll be fine. But it seems that the Phillies might be playing a little bit of a different baseball that they were playing before the All-Star break. Now, this isn't totally something to panic about. The Guardians are still 61-41 on the season, while the Phillies fell to 64-39. But the biggest issue here is that everyone said the Phillies had a soft schedule, that the Phillies couldn't handle it, that when it did come time to play teams that were decent, like the Dodgers again, who they swept, but also perhaps a team like the Guardians, who has a winning record, that it might be a little bit more difficult for them, that maybe they wouldn't be able to win these games. And again, not trying to jump to conclusions here. They play again at 6:05 p.m. Tyler Phillips is expected to pitch, and then Suarez expected to pitch on Sunday. But it would be nice to win this series, because then they have to play the Yankees. Now, the Yankees have been struggling themselves, so this will be an interesting series if the Yankees end up losing to Boston and the Phillies end up losing to the Guardians, and then they'll see who can get back on track and win that series. But you guys just got to keep that in mind. Win against the Guardians, then you got to go on to play the Yankees. This is where it all comes down to the Phillies, but they've made some moves. No, it was not Tommy Pham like we talked about last week and the possibility of Pham becoming a Philadelphia Philly, but they did go out and get some help in the outfield. The Orioles traded outfielder Austin Hayes earlier this week to Philadelphia for right-hander Sir Anthony Dominguez, who pitched last night for the Orioles on Friday night. And this is, I think, a great trade for the Philadelphia Phillies. There was issues with Tommy Pham, a lot of questions of, is he a clubhouse guy? Is this going to cause some issues between some other guys, perhaps some older guys, because Tommy Pham's a little older, and some other guys like Schwarber and Bryce Harper, older as well, all more experienced. Will they butt heads? This just eliminated all the situations. Austin Hayes, you needed that outfielder. The center was a great position. This helps the Phillies out a little bit. but also it worked out perfectly since Michael Rucker is coming off that 60-day IL, so we'll fill that pitching roster spot after they just traded Sir Anthony Dominguez. But Austin Hayes also has a little bit of a bat. Now, he had 157 at-bats this season, 40 runs, 3 home runs for Austin Hayes. But last year, I know statistics are very boring, but I think they're important when a guy gets traded. Not only was he an American League starter at the center field position in 2023, but he had a few career highs. He scored 76 runs, had 143 hits, and 40 multi-hit games, along with 5 stolen bases. I really think that this is a good trade for the Phillies. The Orioles got some young guys in return. This is good for the Philadelphia Phillies. They needed something now. Again, if they're one of the best teams that we've seen in a very long time, cap that off by winning a World Series. I understand that it's a few months away, that right now we're in summer mode, but this is after the All-Star break. The trade deadline is just a few days away on July 30th. Get a guy who you know that there's not going to be any problems. There's no question over if there's going to be clubhouse issues. And now you have a guy out there in center field who's helping you, hopefully will help you win games against the Guardians, against the Yankees, and for the rest of the season. Let's move on, continuing on our segment of What's the Scoop with the Summer Olympics that officially kicked off on Friday night. And fun fact to throw in here, in 1924, Paris, France hosted the 8th Summer Olympics in modern day, of course. Now, once again, they're back in Paris, France. Like I said, officially started on Friday. USA has already brought home a gold medal in swimming. Cook and Bacon, just perfect American nicknames, right? Has brought home the first gold medal for the United States. I also wanted to touch on some of the new sports that will be in the Olympics this year. Breakdancing, or as the IOC is calling the International Olympic Committee, breaking. And what I found interesting about this is that it's all solo. So no one will have partners. To me, it reminded me a little bit of ice skating, just the gracefulness that might come with this and the talent in terms of dancing and the skill. There's always, for the most part, there are some solo in ice skating, but you have that partnership aspect of it, but not in breakdancing. This will all be solo, and they'll be showcasing their skills by themselves. Also, sports climbing will be a part of it, skateboarding and surfing. And when I learned last night, according to CBS, that surfing has been trying to become an Olympic sport since 1920. It finally got that opportunity back in the Tokyo Olympics, and now officially will be in the Olympics in 2024 in Paris, France, in the next 2 weeks. The games have continued all day, and we'll keep you updated on that next week, as well as the Olympics will roll on. But I wanted to head on to our next segment as that wraps up What's the Scoop. Let's get on to Coastal Countdown. So continuing a little bit on the Olympics, let's talk about the media rights deal of all of this. In 1993, NBC TV was awarded coverage for the 1996 Olympics for $456 million. That is what they had to pay in order to get this coverage. And that was after, in 1992, they paid $401 million to be able to have coverage of the Olympics. And now 1992, if many of you remember, that was the year that professional basketball players were able to play in the Olympics and compete in the Olympics for the first time. But all of this comes full circle as earlier this week on Thursday, it was announced that TNT and NBA will end their partnership after 35 years. The partnership began in 1989. It will officially end in 2025 as of right now. Instead, the NBA said that they have moved on. They signed an 11-year media rights contract with Disney, NBC, Prime Video earlier this week, and Amazon is expected to pay $1.8 billion to the NBA for it. And the NBA is great at these types of deals. It gets me to talking about globalization. With Tencent, a media rights group in China, the NBA has a $1.5 billion streaming deal with them. Also in Poland, the NBA has signed a deal with Canal Plus that allows streaming services and live broadcast rights to games. It all goes with that globalization of the game. How do we expand this game? And that's why I mentioned the Olympics, because that's where it all started. It started in 1992 with Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen and Larry Bird all becoming a part of this international or this USA team and winning it all. And it encouraged other basketball players to say, I want to go over here and play in the NBA. This is the best of the best. And just to put this into perspective in terms of the NBA signing international deals, 23 international players in 1992 played in the NBA from 18 different countries. That has increased dramatically. In 2021, 109 international players from 39 countries were in the NBA. That is awesome, and that's great to say, but it comes at a cost for fans in the US who now have to pay more money, or at least will have to pay more money, to watch these games because these streaming services are willing to pay and have the money to pay, because they can stream to anybody, the cost of the NBA's new rights deals. In fact, 41% of the NBA money, they made $10.9 billion in revenue in 2023. 41% of that came from national TV and media. So the NBA doesn't want to stop, but there has been some backlash from this, specifically from Charles Barkley, who is an analyst on TNT and has been for years on one of the most popular shows on TNT. Barkley wrote via social media Friday, "Clearly the NBA has wanted to break up with us," meaning TNT, "from the beginning. I'm not sure TNT ever had a chance. TNT matched the money. The league knows Amazon and these tech companies are the only ones willing to pay for the rights when they double in the future. The NBA," I'll say this a little differently than he did, "didn't want to make them upset." And then he ended saying, "It's a sad day when owners and commissioners choose money over the fans." Inside the NBA with TNT has been very popular. Charles Barkley, one of the men leading that charge, along with a guy like Shaquille O'Neal. The show has won 19 Emmys, including 3 in 2024, one which Barkley won himself for the Outstanding Studio Analyst Award. And all of that is going to end in 2025. Now, we see this happen a lot. We see it with college football and the SEC, that they have ended their rights with CBS. But it seems that it's just been changing more dramatically. And that goes into TNT and what they have been saying, that they did match the deal with Amazon. And apparently, according to TNT, the NBA still declined it, while the NBA has said something a little bit differently, is that it wasn't really that they matched the offer. As they quoted, it was not a true match. But all of that goes to show that if they did match this offer, Charles Barkley is likely onto something, and many of us are. As like, think about everyone who uses Amazon, think about everyone who uses these deals. The truth is, they just have more money. And it does, at the end of the day, it is going to hurt fans who are here, who do not want to stream it and still have cable and cannot afford to buy all of these different streaming services. But the same thing is happening with the NFL. This is not just stopping here in the NBA. In fact, it will cost fans, the average NFL fan. If you're like me, I like to watch every game. I love watching Red Zone, but I have friends who say, I need to watch one game at a time. I need it on 5 different TVs. And possibly they can do that. Well, they could do that with cable a few years ago. They could do that with 1 or 2 streaming services. But now, if you're an NFL fan and your attempt to watch every single game this season is going to cost you a very pretty penny. It will be nearly $800 to watch every game. The NFL will stream games from Peacock, ESPN Plus, Amazon Prime, YouTube TV, NFL Sunday Ticket rather, and Netflix. I don't even have half those streaming services, truthfully, but this all goes to the money at the end of the day. And I mean, I think there's a famous song called "Cream Cash Rules Everything Around Me." So we cannot be blind to that fact. But to speak on the financial terms of it all, we talked about the NBA and the money that they made from the national TV and media. The NFL makes even more. The NFL, 66% of their $18.7 billion in revenue in 2023 came from national TV and media. Fans did some calculations, which I found fascinating. When they calculated all this, they found that it will cost about, obviously depending on seats, probably not the best seats, but it will cost Panthers fans about $695 to attend every Panthers home game. There are 9 of them this season. And that, of course, like we had just mentioned, will be cheaper than watching any of the games in person or trying to watch every NFL game on TV from the comfort of your own home, because it will cost up to $800 or more to try to stream every single game. Definitely some things changing, and that is why we have this segment of Coastal Countdown. Not only does it talk about the games that are ahead, possible trades, but also some things that throughout the next few years, it's going to get interesting. So that wraps it up for Coastal Countdown. Let's wrap the show up with my favorite segment, of Social Scoreboard. So if you haven't heard, or maybe you just don't want to hear this, unless maybe you're a Packers fan, Jordan Love is now the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. Probably not great if you're a Dallas Cowboys fan. You're going to have to pay Dak Prescott a lot. Joe Burrow isn't getting that money. Patrick Mahomes isn't getting that money. Jordan Love is getting a 4-year deal worth $22 million. With all that being said, he will get a 4-year deal. He will get $22 million a year. It will be $155 million guaranteed, along with a $75 million signing bonus. This reminds me a lot of somebody, because Jordan Love is 12-15 in his career. He has beat the Dallas Cowboys in the playoffs, which the Green Bay Packers are great at doing. So I don't know how much of an accomplishment, if you're a Packers fan, you think that is, considering many quarterbacks have been able to go on and beat the Dallas Cowboys. It seems to be the Cowboys' Achilles heel. And he has never made it to a Pro Bowl. This is very similar to Sam Bradford, who signed, now granted he was a lot older when he signed with the Philadelphia Eagles, but he signed a 2-year, $36 million contract years ago with an $11 million signing bonus and $22 million guaranteed. He was expected to get an average salary of $18 million a year. And he as well never had a winning record. He was 34, 48, and 1 in his career. Jordan Love is 12-15 in his career, and the Packers just signed him to a 4-year extension worth $220 million to make him the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. Now, I'm not saying Jordan Love is going to be the next Sam Bradford. He has plenty of time left, but for a guy who played well for about half of a season last year, that is a lot of money. And his agent did a really great job for him. But you have to think about this quarterback market, and he broke it. That is something that's happening in the NFL, that Dak Prescott has yet to get paid yet. He's waiting for a contract. He has won 2 to 3 playoff games for the Dallas Cowboys, and all of a sudden, is he going to have to become the next highest paid quarterback? Just because of this Jordan Love deal? Just because Jordan Love and Dak Prescott says, hey, I've won a few more playoff games than him. I've led this team for a few more years than him. I came in under different circumstances where Tony Romo just got hurt. I didn't have time to develop like Jordan Love did. Yikes. This is going to look scary for quarterbacks in the future if this means that it broke the market. But let's see what fans had to say about it. So again, I've mentioned Social Scoreboards. We took it to X to see what were fans saying and what were their thoughts about Jordan Love becoming the highest paid quarterback in NFL history. Somebody commented after the NFL posted this news. Very simple, just a question. I quote, "And what has he done?" At M. Sipes on X. I mentioned Dak Prescott. He's got to be having a field day, right? Hey, maybe this contract, again, his agent can ask for a lot more than maybe what they were intending. But I agree. What has he done? We live in a world where I agree you should get paid. You're working hard. This is a job, and you need to make as much money as you can, especially in the NFL, because it can end at any moment. But what has Jordan Love done to earn that money? That seems that you're riding on a lot of hope, if you're the Green Bay Packers, that he's going to be good, that he's your franchise quarterback. So that was coming in at number 3. Coming in at number 2, at my coffin, looks like everyone else on the Packers is getting a pay cut for the next 4 years. Good job. We talked about clubhouse issues with the Phillies. I don't think this will cause any locker room issues, but it will be interesting to see the next few years about that secondary. You know, the one that when Aaron Rodgers was there, that he said, hey, you guys draft a lot of players on defense. Can I have a wide receiver? And he never got it. It'll be interesting to see how many guys are saying, yeah, Green Bay Packers, can you pay me? Can you afford it? Do you have the salary cap money for it? Because you're paying Jordan Love a lot of money. And the last time I checked, he can't play 3 positions at once. Coming in at number 1, which I found this very valid, and I'll explain momentarily, at Dinger_D, this dude brought my fantasy team from last to a playoff berth in 5 weeks. Well deserved. And I like this because it's true. While I did not have Jordan Love, I did have Josh Hines-Allen and on my fantasy team, and he helped me win a fantasy football championship 2 years ago. He was on the Jaguars. He got a pick six. I won by 2 points. Also, Dawson Knox scored me a touchdown, which helped, but I had picked up the Jaguars defense that week. So that is what made the difference. That had I not picked up the Jaguars defense, had I not gained that 6 points from Allen getting that pick six, I would have not have won a fantasy football championship, which is, of course, why I got an Allen jersey, right? I'm going to support him. I'm going to support him any way I can, and then people look at me sideways. Why are you wearing a Jaguars jersey? Let me explain. This was a big moment for me. So just like this dude, hey, Jordan Love deserves it. He's not dishing out any money. The Green Bay Packers are, and they are very confident in their starting quarterback, with Jordan Love becoming the highest paid quarterback in the NFL. That is all I got for you today on the Beachside Blitz. Be sure to tune in again next Saturday from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Thanks so much for hanging with me today on the Beachside Blitz, where we surf the wave of sports. I am your host, Patricia Caputo, and you are listening to Cape May Radio, WCFA 101.5 FM, the radio station for the Center of Community Arts, Cape May.